My name is Max Taylor and I'm a Senior Regional Analyst at Intelligence Fusion, where I focus on the Middle East, South and Central Asia regions. And in this week's video, I'm going to be focusing on the TAPI pipeline and what's changed for the TAPI pipeline since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. So when we filmed part one of the TAPI pipeline podcast, it was before the Taliban had taken over Kabul and completely seized control of the whole country as well. So since then, obviously, as I'm sure viewers will be aware, the Taliban have taken over the country. And as a result, security considerations for the TAPI pipeline have changed quite dramatically. So previously, in previous decades, the fighting between the Taliban and the Afghan government has been one of the main factors holding the pipeline back, because the pipeline aims to run through some of the most insecure provinces of Afghanistan. So these are Herat, Farah province, Helmand province and Kandahar province. And Helmand and Kandahar in particular are key Taliban strongholds. So now that the government's collapsed and the Afghan Taliban are now in control of the country, this security consideration has effectively vanished, because the Taliban are obviously not going to fight themselves. And so you can see on our incident platform at the moment as well that there's actually very few security-related incidents in these provinces now, and instead it's much more stable is perhaps the wrong word to use, because I think it's still too early to tell whether the country is stable or not. But we're seeing much less incidents such as skirmishes, ambushes and IEDs targeting security forces, simply because there's no targets there anymore. So from a pipeline perspective instead, I would say whilst this security situation has changed, I wouldn't say the security situation is fine. The pipeline is free to go unhindered, because the Taliban do still have their challenges and their security challenges to overcome. So for example, the militia forces which emerged after the fall of Kabul, and whilst they are much less active now, they are still actively fighting the Taliban, although mostly in isolated areas of Panjshir province as well as Baghlan province. And these two provinces aren't actually on the pipeline route. But again, there's nothing stopping them from perhaps an IED attack targeting any potential construction site along the pipeline in years to come. And also what we've seen since the Taliban captured Kabul was Islamic State trying to act as a spoiler. And Islamic State are aware that the Taliban want to attract international investment, international attention, by portraying themselves as these providers of security. Now that the government's gone, the Taliban want Afghanistan to be this secure country where the Taliban can say, we did that, we provided that security. And as I just mentioned, Islamic State want to act as a spoiler for this. And so Islamic State attacks, which we've seen regularly now in Jalalabad and Kabul, as well as in Parwan province in the east, have been almost a daily occurrence. And it seems likely to assume that ISIS would want to target this pipeline as well if it were to be built. Yeah, so I think as well as like the tactical level security considerations in Afghanistan itself, the geopolitical levels changed quite dramatically as well. So in the previous podcast, you mentioned that the USA has always been quite a big supporter of the TAPI pipeline, and they support it because it not only takes away Russia's stranglehold on Turkmen gas markets, it also doesn't go through Iran. So Iran doesn't benefit from this pipeline, and Iran loses some influence in the region too. However, as can be expected, now that the Taliban have taken control, the USA is going to be much less conducive to building this pipeline in Afghanistan, and likely going to withdraw much, if not all, of their support for this pipeline, which already looks increasingly unsuited to modern politics. But it's not just the USA who've changed their security considerations as well, actually. So the pipeline's always been quite an unpopular project in India for two reasons. For the pre-Taliban reason really being that it traverses Pakistan, and Pakistan will gain transit fees from this pipeline, and India will obviously be benefiting as well. But as a result, this has been an unpopular pipeline among a lot of Indian politicians who see this as almost as it's benefiting Pakistan more than it is benefiting India, and it gives Pakistan some leverage over India as well, because obviously it runs through Pakistan before it reaches India. But also, since the Taliban takeover, another consideration has changed, and this has almost added to a lot of Indian politicians' worries about the pipeline, in that now that the Taliban are a traditional enemy of the Indian government, now that the Taliban have taken over in Afghanistan, it's not only going to be benefiting Pakistan, a traditional opponent of India, it's also going to be benefiting the Afghan Taliban. And so there is a possibility still that with this pipeline project still being in its very early stages, that India may not necessarily completely pull out, but may perhaps withdraw funding or withdraw some form of support. And this is already a cash-strapped project even before the Taliban takeover. So it is hard. So there certainly is other issues now that some are long-term issues pre-Taliban takeover, but there's certainly more geopolitical issues now since the Taliban have taken over, as observers may perhaps start to change their stance on this project. So we've touched briefly there on the funding as well, and whether the Indian government and the US, for example, may withdraw some of its support. And this financial support actually from all backers of the project is quite a key issue, and it's always been an issue. I don't want to sit here and say that, since the Taliban took over Afghanistan, finance is now becoming an issue for the pipeline, because there's always been question marks over exactly how the pipeline is going to be funded. And previously, both Turkmenistan and Afghanistan have their governments pledged to provide quite a substantial amount of funding for the project, and this is quite rare for the governments themselves to be providing so much money for this supposedly flagship project. But since these pledges were made years ago now, both Turkmenistan and Afghanistan have gone into quite large economic slumps, and the Turkmenistan media obviously is not really permitted to cover it, but we're seeing a lot of reporting that the Turkmen government's really struggling to control this economic slump. And obviously, since the Afghan Taliban took over, a lot of the Afghan government's funds have been sanctioned and they've been stopped, and the Taliban just simply haven't got access to the funds that the Afghan government have. And even before the takeover, the Afghan government was hugely reliant on foreign backing in the first place. So this money that the Afghan government would have been then putting towards the TAPI pipeline would indirectly have been given by foreign donors. So these financial concerns that existed for the pipeline even before the Taliban takeover have just suddenly become much more compounded and much more significant, in my opinion. With all these problems in mind, I don't think that's enough to say that this pipeline is dead in the water, it's never going to happen, because the Turkmen government in particular has really pushed hard for quite a long time now, actually, even before the Taliban takeover, has really pushed hard to get this pipeline project going, and construction work is taking place all the way up to the border with Afghanistan. And there has been some pre-construction work in Afghanistan itself back in the Afghan government era. So there's clearly willingness. There's clearly, despite these economic issues, as well as some persisting security issues, there's clearly willingness. And the Taliban themselves are also very keen to get this project on the ground. And they've actually, since they took over Kabul, they've engaged in a series of talks now with the Turkmen government. And whilst these talks weren't specifically about the TAPI pipeline, it's pretty certain that this pipeline came up, with this being a potential flagship project for the Taliban, to show to the world, look, they're trying to fit their narrative that they're this different group to what they were back in 2001 and before, and they want the world to think that they're this legitimate political force. And so this project may just be their gateway to that. So even with these security and financial issues, there's a lot of drive behind it at the moment, and there's a lot of willingness from both Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even India in some respects to get this pipeline going.